Hi, my name is Martha, and last month my brother Thomas called me early on a Saturday morning. His voice was sharp, clipped, like something urgent had happened. He told me it was a family emergency. Those were his exact words. Now, when someone says, family emergency, your mind doesn't jump to paperwork. You think of hospitals, accidents, sudden illnesses. I thought maybe our aunt had collapsed, or Thomas himself had gotten bad news from his doctor. My heart sank as I threw on a coat and rushed out the door. The drive to his house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your chest when your brain is trying to catch up with your fear. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, and the closer I got, the more convinced I was that something terrible had happened. But when I pulled into his driveway, there was no ambulance, no signs of panic, not even the flicker of a worried neighbor's light. The house looked calm, almost staged, like nothing inside could possibly be wrong. Thomas opened the door before I knocked. His shirt was crisp, his hair combed back like he had been preparing for this moment. He even smiled a little, as though the word emergency had been nothing more than bait to get me there. "Come in," he said, stepping aside like he was greeting a guest instead of his own sister. I walked inside, bracing myself. My eyes darted around the living room. No 4 bags, no oxygen tank, no signs of distress. The smell of coffee lingered faintly, but the pot was already empty. The whole scene felt rehearsed. And then I saw it. On the dining room table, right where we used to spread out puzzles as kids, sat a thick envelope, a manila folder perfectly squared, papers stacked inside. Thomas gestured to it like a magician revealing the final act of a trick. "Sit down," he said. I sat slowly, every muscle in my body tensing. He slid the folder across the polished wood, his fingertips barely grazing it. "Open it." My breath hitched as I reached for the folder. For a split second, I still thought this could be about medical records, maybe some inheritance detail or paperwork I needed to sign in a hurry. But the moment I flipped it open, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a will, it wasn't an insurance form, it was an invoice. The title, bold and centered, nearly knocked the air out of me. Reimbursement for parental investment. I blinked. My eyes scanned the lines. Formula and baby food, $3,200. School clothes, $5,000. Transportation to and from classes, $18,400. Family cell phone plan, $2,160. Emotional labor, $10,000. Line after line, year after year. Every birthday cake, every doctor's visit, every extracurricular activity, down to the last penny. The total at the bottom, $150,347.92. I looked up slowly, hoping this was some kind of cruel joke, something he'd laugh about in a second. "You're serious?" I asked, my voice flat. Thomas folded his hands, his face calm but cold. "You've done well for yourself, Martha. You have a steady job, a good salary. It's only fair you give back. Balance the scales." Balance the scales? The words echoed in my head like a hammer hitting metal. I stared at him, at the man who had once pushed me on the swings in our backyard, who had eaten Pop-Tarts with me on Saturday mornings. Was this really my brother, reducing me to a bill? I wanted to laugh, but it wasn't funny. It was grotesque. I slid the papers back into the folder, my fingers trembling. Not from fear, but from the sheer weight of betrayal. "When?" I asked quietly. "Did I stop being your sister and become a debt to collect?" He didn't answer. He just sat there, posture stiff, waiting for me to agree. And in that moment, I realized the emergency wasn't about sickness. It wasn't about family at all. It was about control. To understand why this cut so deep, you need to know a little about our family. Thomas and I grew up in a small town in Iowa in a modest 2-story house with peeling white paint and a porch swing that creaked no matter how often Dad tried to oil it. We weren't wealthy. We weren't perfect. But we had each other, or at least that's what I believed for most of my life. When Dad got sick, I was the one who stayed. I was there at the hospital, holding his hand, spoon-feeding him soup when he was too weak to lift a spoon himself. I was there on the nights when his fever spiked and the doctors whispered about not much time left. Thomas? He visited sometimes, a weekend here, a quick afternoon there. But then he'd disappear back into his own life, far from the weight of illness and unpaid bills. He never stayed long enough to feel how heavy it was to watch someone you love fade away. When Dad finally passed, I handled the funeral. I sorted through his clothes, folded his shirts, donated what I could, and kept one old flannel that still smelled faintly like him. I cleaned out his desk, packed away the photo albums, paid the last of his medical bills. Thomas was there, but only in snapshots. He showed up at the service in a dark suit, shook hands, hugged old neighbors, and then left before the food had even cooled on the church basement tables. That was the pattern of our lives, me carrying the weight, him sweeping in just long enough to look like part of the picture. So when he called me that Saturday morning saying it was a family emergency, I believed him. Because even after all these years, a part of me still hoped he'd put family before himself. Instead, he handed me a bill. That invoice wasn't just paper. It was proof. Proof that in his eyes, I wasn't a sister. I was a debt to be settled, a liability to be squared off before he moved on to whatever future assets he thought were still waiting for him. And yet, as shocking as that was, I wasn't completely unprepared, because hidden in my purse, tucked safely in the side pocket where I kept the most important things, was an envelope of my own, one my father had left behind, one that Thomas had hoped I'd never find. But that part of the story comes later. Thomas sat across from me, his posture straight, his hands folded neatly, like this was some kind of formal negotiation, not a conversation between siblings, not family, business. "You've done well for yourself, Martha," he repeated. "You have a career. You own your home. You don't struggle the way most people do. It's only right that you give back. Think of it as balancing the scales. Balancing the scales." He said it again, like the phrase would make theft sound noble. My throat tightened, but I forced my voice to stay calm. "You kept track of all this?" I asked, tapping the invoice. "Of course," Thomas said, nodding with quiet pride. "I started recording when you were a baby. Formula, diapers, doctor visits, it all adds up. People think raising a child is free, but it's not. And it's time you acknowledge that I blinked, trying to comprehend the absurdity of it all." "You're billing me for my own childhood?" He leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other. "Not billing. Just asking you to be fair, to recognize the investment we made in you. Dad would have wanted this." The mention of Dad made my chest ache. "Dad?" I whispered. "The same Dad I sat beside for weeks in the hospital while you were too busy to visit? The Dad who left me a letter reminding me that love isn't a transaction?" Thomas's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. I picked up the invoice again and scanned down the page. My eyes caught on one line in particular: emotional support, unreciprocated, $8,000. My breath hitched, a bitter laugh escaping before I could stop it. Emotional support? You're charging me for your absence? For the birthdays you didn't come to? The nights you left me alone with Dad's fever? You call that emotional support? He shrugged. You're exaggerating. We did what we could. And don't act like you've been some perfect daughter or sister. You left too. You moved out. You started your own life. You barely call. I stared at him, the room suddenly smaller, air heavier. He was rewriting history right in front of me, twisting it to fit his narrative. It was gaslighting in its purest form. "Thomas," I said slowly, choosing each word with precision, "I didn't leave. I survived. That's different." For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the faint tick of the wall clock above us. Then his wife, Elaine, appeared in the doorway. She carried a mug of coffee, her eyes avoiding mine as she set it down beside him. She didn't speak, but the tension in her shoulders told me she already knew what this was about. "Elaine agrees with me," Thomas said, seizing the moment. "Don't you, honey?" Elaine froze, her lips parting slightly, then pressed together again. She glanced at me, her eyes flickering with something, regret, maybe, fear, but she said nothing. She just retreated quietly back into the kitchen, leaving her silence behind like a shadow. That silence was answer enough. I looked back at Thomas, my voice firmer now. "So this was your plan? Call me here under false pretenses, throw a bill on the table, and expect me to sign a check?" He smirked. "I thought you'd understand. You've always been practical. You know numbers don't lie, numbers don't lie." I repeated the phrase in my head. He thought hiding behind numbers would make him righteous. But numbers could be forged, twisted, manipulated, just like memories. "Tell me something," I said, leaning forward, lowering my voice. "When exactly did you decide to keep a ledger instead of a heart? Was it before Dad got sick or after you realized he trusted me more than you?" His face darkened, but he forced a thin smile. "Dad loved us both." "Loved us both, yes," I said. "But he trusted me." "That's the difference, Thomas, and you've never forgiven me for that." His knuckles whitened as his fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. For a second, I thought he might lash out, but he stayed still, too controlled. I flipped to the last page of the invoice, where the grand total was circled in red ink. $150,347.92. Beneath it, in smaller letters, he'd written, "Payment plan available upon request." I laughed again, sharper this time. "A payment plan? Do you hear yourself? You sound like a loan officer, not a brother." He didn't flinch. "That's generous, Martha." I could have asked for it all up front, but I'm willing to work with you because this isn't about punishment. It's about fairness. Fairness. The word made bile rise in my throat. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment, then let my eyes fall back on him. "Fairness," I repeated softly. "Do you really want to talk about fairness? Do you remember the nights I sat in the hospital while Dad asked for you and you didn't come? Do you remember me selling my jewelry to cover his medication while you were off in Florida with Elaine? Do you remember Dad's funeral, when you left before the flowers had even wilted?" Thomas shifted in his seat, his composure cracking. "You're being dramatic." "Dramatic?" I said, my voice steel under velvet. "Drama doesn't forge signatures. Drama doesn't hide wills. Drama doesn't sell property that doesn't belong to you." His eyes flickered, just for a second. A flash of guilt, or maybe fear. And that was all the confirmation I needed, because what Thomas didn't know was that I had already found the truth. Hidden in Dad's old lockbox, tucked away in a safety deposit vault he thought I'd never open, was the original will. The notarized, legal, undeniable proof that everything Thomas wanted, the house, the land, the savings, was meant for me. But I wasn't going to reveal that just yet. Not while he thought he still had the upper hand. Instead, I leaned forward, folded the invoice carefully, and slid it back across the table. "You know what, Thomas?" I said quietly. "If you want to treat this like business, fine. But don't forget one thing. Business has receipts, and I've kept mine too." His eyes narrowed, confusion flickering across his face. He opened his mouth to respond, but for once he didn't have words. The air between us thickened, humming with the weight of everything unsaid. And in that heavy silence, I knew the war between us had only just begun. The folder sat between us like a silent weapon. Thomas thought he had cornered me, pinned me down with numbers and guilt. But he didn't know the truth had been sitting in my purse the whole time, waiting for the right moment I took a slow breath, steadying my hands. "You say this is about fairness," I said, my tone calm, deliberate. "Then let's be fair." I reached into my bag and pulled out a smaller envelope, old, worn at the edges, the kind of paper that carried history in its creases. I didn't slide it across the table right away. Instead, I held it, letting the weight of it hang in the air. Thomas frowned. "What's that?" I looked him dead in the eye. "Receipts, Thomas." "The kind you can't fake." His smirk faltered. For the first time that morning, I saw unease flicker in his eyes. Carefully, I laid the envelope on the table and unfolded its contents. 3 crisp documents, notarized, stamped, and signed. Originals, not copies, not forgeries. The kind of paper that could strip the facade right off a man. "This," I said softly, sliding the first sheet toward him, "is Dad's will. The real one, the one you swore didn't exist." Thomas froze. His eyes darted down, scanning the page, then back up to me. His lips parted, but no words came out. I tapped the bold heading at the top, "Last Will and Testament of James Holloway." "You see that date?" I pointed. 3 days after Dad passed, this was filed with the county clerk. Your name is right there, Thomas, executor of the estate. You knew exactly what this said, and yet, somehow, none of it ever reached me. The color drained from his face. He tried to speak, but his throat caught. Elaine appeared in the doorway again, her hand gripping the frame so tight her knuckles whitened. Her eyes darted to the paper, then to Thomas. She didn't ask. She already knew. I pulled out the second document. "This," I continued, my voice steady, "is the property transfer you filed 6 months later. The deed to Dad's land. Signed, sealed, delivered. Straight into your name. You told me it had been sold to cover medical debt." "That was a lie." Thomas's hands trembled against the table. You don't understand." "No," I cut in sharply, my voice rising for the first time. "I understand perfectly. You forged, you concealed, and you stole, all under the pretense of family." Elaine whispered something under her breath, so soft I barely caught it. Oh my God. I didn't stop. I pulled out the third paper. This one I handled more gently because it wasn't just legal proof, it was personal. A letter. Dad's handwriting, faded but still strong, his words etched into every fiber of the page. "He left this for me," I said, my voice cracking just slightly. "Not you, not Elaine." I unfolded the letter and read aloud. "Martha, if you're holding this, it means you found what I tried to leave behind for you. I know Thomas will be angry. He always believed things belonged to him if he wanted them enough. But I need you to know this. You don't owe anyone for the life I gave you. You already repaid me. Every day you sat by my side when no one else did. The land, the house, the savings, they're yours. Because you were there. And that's what matters." The words echoed in the silence. Elaine's hand flew to her mouth. Thomas's face crumpled, not with sorrow, but with fury. "You think this changes anything?" he snapped. His voice was louder now, brittle with panic. "You think a few pieces of paper erase decades of responsibility? I carried this family. I made sure we survived after Mom left. Without me, there wouldn't have been a roof over your head." I stared at him, letting the weight of his lies collapse under the truth. "Without you?" I repeated. "Thomas, you were gone half the time. And when you were here, you weren't present. Dad carried us. I carried him when he couldn't anymore. And you carried nothing but your entitlement." He slammed his fist on the table, the documents fluttering from the force. "You can't prove any of this in court." A bitter smile touched my lips. "Oh, but I can. The clerk's signature is right there. The notarization is clear. And if that isn't enough, I have a recording from the day you filed that transfer. The county office keeps backups, Thomas. Paper trails don't lie." His breath hitched. His bravado cracked. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in my brother's eyes. Not fear of me, but of the truth he couldn't bury anymore. Elaine's voice broke through the tension, trembling. "Thomas, is it true?" He didn't answer. His silence was enough. I gathered the documents back into my envelope, sliding them in with deliberate calm. "You wanted to turn this into business. Fine. But in business, there are consequences, and I'm done being quiet." I stood slinging my bag over my shoulder. My voice softened, but every word carried steel. "You sent me a bill for $150,000, but the truth costs more than that. And trust me, Thomas, it's a debt you can't repay." The room fell utterly still. The clock on the wall ticked louder, marking the moment the balance of power shifted forever. As I turned toward the door, Thomas whispered hoarsely, "You were never supposed to find that." I paused, glancing back just long enough to meet his eyes. "That's the thing about truth, Thomas. It waits, quietly, patiently, until someone finally opens the right box." And then I walked out, leaving him with nothing but the wreckage of his lies. I left Thomas's dining room that morning with my father's letter pressed against my chest, the words echoing like a shield in my mind. "You don't owe anyone for the life I gave you." But I knew this wasn't over. Truth has a way of demanding more than a single confrontation. Paper trails don't just sit quietly, they ripple, they spread, they find their way into boardrooms and courtrooms until there's no place left to hide. 3 weeks later, I found myself in a plain building sandwiched between a dental office and a tax prep agency. The sign out front read, "Mediation Center." Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in a pale, sterile glow. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. I had arrived early, as I always did. Sitting at the long oak conference table, I laid out my folder. Dad's original will, the notarized property documents, and the letter he'd written in his own hand. I wasn't nervous. Not anymore. I wasn't angry either, just steady. Done. The door opened with a soft click. Elaine entered first. Her posture was smaller than before, her lipstick uneven. She carried herself like someone dragged into a storm she hadn't prepared for. Behind her came Thomas. His tie was crooked, his face lined with exhaustion. He didn't meet my eyes. The mediator followed, a middle-aged woman in a neutral gray suit. She placed a neat stack of forms on the table. "Thank you all for coming," she said evenly. "Today is private, binding, and focused solely on resolution. Not feelings, not blame. Resolution?" I nodded. Thomas said nothing. Elaine shifted in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. The mediator looked at me. "Martha, you've brought documents to support your position." I slid the folder forward. "Yes, originals, notarized, and an affidavit from the county clerk confirming authenticity." Thomas's jaw tightened. His knuckles tapped against the table, restless. The mediator opened the folder, adjusted her glasses, and skimmed the papers. After a moment, she set them down with deliberate care. "These are valid," which means the property and accounts were misallocated. Elaine inhaled sharply. Thomas's head dropped into his hands. I leaned forward, my voice calm. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I'm not here to destroy what little remains of this family, but I won't allow theft to stand as tradition. My offer is simple: repayment of $160,000 within 60 days, and a signed affidavit relinquishing any future claim to Dad's estate or property." Thomas's head snapped up. "That's extortion." "No," I said softly. "That's mercy." Because if I took this to court, Thomas, it wouldn't just be about money. It would be about fraud, about forgery, about criminal charges. And you know it. Silence pressed into the room. Elaine looked at him, eyes wide with disbelief. "Is that true? Did you—" Thomas didn't answer. His silence was its own confession. The mediator folded her hands. This is a serious offer. I suggest you both consider the cost of fighting versus settling." For a long time, no one spoke. The clock ticked, each second louder than the last. Finally, Elaine whispered, "Thomas, we can't fight this. She has everything." His face crumpled, pride and panic colliding. "I did it for us," he muttered. "For the family." To keep things together, I shook my head slowly. "Don't dress theft in noble clothing. You didn't do it for us. You did it because you thought I'd stay silent. You counted on my loyalty, on my love to keep your secret, but you underestimated the one thing Dad gave me that you never understood. A voice." Elaine reached for a pen with trembling fingers. "I'll sign," she whispered. Thomas glared at her. "Don't you dare!" "Enough!" she snapped, startling both of us. Her voice cracked, but her spine straightened. "I've watched you twist everything for years. I've kept quiet because I thought it was easier, but she's right, Thomas. Numbers don't lie, and neither does this." She tapped the folder with shaking hands. For once, he was the one left speechless. The mediator slid the affidavit forward. "Thomas, the decision is yours. But I'll remind you, if this goes to trial, the penalties won't be financial alone." He stared at the paper like it might burn him. His chest rose and fell sharply. Finally, with a grunt, he snatched the pen and scribbled his name. The sound of ink scratching across the page was louder than any argument. Final. Binding. Elaine signed next, her hand trembling but resolute. When the papers slid back across the table, I collected them, folded them neatly into my folder, and closed it with a soft thud. The room felt lighter, emptier, not victorious, just finished. I stood, pushing my chair back. "This isn't closure," I said quietly. "It's just me stepping out of the wreckage." Thomas didn't look at me. Elaine wiped at her eyes, silent. The mediator gathered her papers and thanked us in that practiced, neutral tone. As I walked to the door, Thomas finally spoke. His voice was low, almost broken. I thought I was protecting peace. I paused, hand on the knob. "There was no peace, Thomas. Only performance." And then I left. The soft click of the door behind me sounded like the last nail in a coffin I'd been carrying too long. Outside, the sky was gray, heavy with clouds. I breathed in the cool air, steady and unshaken. For the first time in years, I felt free. Not triumphant, not joyful, just free. And sometimes, that's enough. The gray sky followed me home like a quiet companion. I didn't turn on the radio as I drove, didn't need the noise. The sound of the tires on the pavement, the rhythm of the wipers brushing away a thin drizzle, that was enough. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically, casting a warm circle of gold on the front steps. It felt almost like an embrace, a reminder that even when family fails you, the world still has places of welcome. Inside, the house was still, not empty, but calm. I slipped off my shoes and walked to the living room, settling into the old velvet chair by the window, the same chair Dad used to sit in when he visited. For a moment, I just breathed, the silence pressing against me in a way that wasn't heavy anymore. On the side table sat a cedar box. I hadn't touched it in years. My fingers lingered on the lid before lifting it open. Inside were old photographs, Dad's notarized will, and one final sealed envelope. His handwriting stretched across the front, familiar and steady, the same hand that had written me lunchbox notes and signed permission slips. My throat tightened. I had carried this envelope for months, maybe years, too afraid to open it. But now, after everything, it was time. I broke the seal carefully. The paper inside was slightly yellowed, the ink faded in spots, but every word was legible. "Martha, if you're reading this, it means you chose the harder road, the one where truth matters more than comfort. I'm proud of you for that. I know Thomas will try to twist things. He always wanted control, even as a boy. But control isn't love. Love doesn't keep score. Love doesn't send invoices. You gave me something no money could buy, time. You sat with me when I was fading, reminded me of who I was when I forgot, and laughed with me when I had nothing left to laugh about. That's not debt, Martha. That's a gift. I need you to believe this. You don't owe them peace for the wars they started. You don't owe them understanding for the lies they chose. What you owe yourself is freedom. Build a life quiet and real, the kind you don't have to prove to anyone. And if one day you need to tell your story, tell it in your own voice. That's the one that matters. I'm proud of you. Always. By the time I reached the last line, tears blurred the ink. But they weren't the kind of tears that come from pain. They were lighter, cleansing, like rain after a storm. I folded the letter gently, tracing the creases with careful fingers. Then I placed it back into the cedar box, alongside the will and a faded Polaroid of Dad and me, fishing when I was 10. His arm around my shoulder, my grin wide and toothy, the lake glimmering behind us. I closed the lid, not with finality, but with peace. Later that evening, I stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool, brushing against my skin like a promise. Stars dotted the sky, faint but steady. I leaned against the railing, letting the quiet settle. That's when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost ignored it, expecting spam or some reminder I didn't need. But the message made me freeze. "Hi, my name is Elise. I'm your cousin. I read what happened with Thomas, and I think we need to talk about what they did to our side of the family." I stared at the screen, the glow lighting up the dark porch. For a long moment, I didn't move. Then slowly, I smiled. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. The next day, I met Elise at a small coffee shop off a side road in town. The windows were fogged with steam, amber light glowing inside. She was already there, a folder on the table in front of her, her hands clasped tight around it. We exchanged a tentative smile. She looked familiar in a way that was hard to explain, like a reflection of someone long gone, a shadow of Dad. "I almost didn't reach out," she admitted softly, "but after what they did to you, I knew I couldn't stay silent." I leaned forward, steady. After what they did to me, I'd be a fool not to listen. She opened her folder slowly. Inside were old letters, some in Dad's handwriting, others from names I didn't recognize, names from branches of our family tree I'd been told never existed. "They cut us out," she whispered, "said we were unstable, said we didn't belong, but we do, and he knew it." I felt my chest ache, not from sorrow, but from the sudden weight of connection, of history resurfacing. "Then let's rebuild it," I said quietly. "Not the lies, the truth." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "More than anything, I want that." That night, I drove to Dad's grave. The wind tugged at my coat as I brushed leaves off the stone. I knelt, pressing my hand against his name. "I found her," I whispered. "I found the family they tried to erase. And I'm not alone anymore." No thunder rolled. No bright light split the sky. Just silence. Honest. Steady. When I returned home, I wrote a letter. Not to Thomas, not to Elaine, to myself. You don't owe them peace for the battles they chose. You don't owe them gratitude for betrayals disguised as love. What you owe yourself is freedom and clarity, and you have it. Now I folded it, slipped it into the cedar box, right between Dad's letter and that old Polaroid, a reminder that the story didn't end with betrayal. It ended with truth. The following morning, as I sat on the porch sipping coffee, a child pedaled by on his bike. He waved, carefree, his laughter carrying in the crisp air. I lifted my hand and waved back, and in that simple gesture I understood. They tried to convince me I was nothing but a debt. But I am not a bill. I am not a burden. I am free. Family isn't meant to be a balance sheet or a list of debts to be collected. It's meant to be love, trust, and honesty. In this story, Martha showed us that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. She proved that real strength comes not from silence, but from courage. Remember this: you don't owe anyone for being alive. What you owe yourself is freedom, peace, and the power to speak your truth. Thank you for watching. If this spoke to your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. And remember, your love, your truth, your place are worth defending,